The idea came to me during a particularly brutal heatwave that had settled over Oakwood Estates like a heavy blanket. As the head of marketing for a regional banking chain, I was fortunate enough to work from home 2 days a week, and that Thursday, as I gazed out my home office window at neighbors trudging by in the 98-degree heat, inspiration struck. A lemonade stand, not for children, but for adults, freshly squeezed, artisanal lemonade with real fruit and herb infusions, a small pleasure to help my neighbors survive the scorching summer. It's perfect professional enough to be respectable, casual enough to be neighborly, and a nice break from staring at spreadsheets all day. I spent that evening planning. By Friday morning I had created elegant signage, purchased high-quality ingredients, and even set up a digital payment option beside the traditional cash box. My stand was a far cry from the wobbly card tables of childhood. I used my teak outdoor bar cart complete with an umbrella for shade, glass dispensers for different lemonade varieties, and proper glassware with a sanitizing station. At 10 a.m., I wheeled my creation to the corner of my front lawn, close enough to the sidewalk to be visible but completely on my property. I was fully aware of our HOA's strict rules about commercial activities, but this was hardly a commercial enterprise. I wasn't even trying to make a profit, just cover my costs and provide a service to the community during extreme weather. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Neighbors walking dogs, mail carriers, landscaping crews, everyone appreciated a cold, fresh beverage in the oppressive heat. I offered 3 varieties: classic lemonade, strawberry basil, and cucumber mint. By noon I had served at least 30 people and received nothing but compliments. "This is exactly what the neighborhood needed," said Ellen from 3 doors down, sipping her strawberry basil lemonade. "Such a civilized way to beat the heat." I was refilling the cucumber mint dispenser when I heard the distinct sound of heels clicking rapidly on the sidewalk. Without looking up, I knew exactly who was approaching. Patricia Wellington, HOA, president and self-appointed guardian of all things proper in Oakwood Estates. Here we go. I wondered how long it would take before she showed up. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice as crisp as her perfectly pressed white linen pantsuit, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" I straightened up and offered my most pleasant smile. "Good afternoon, Patricia. Would you care for some lemonade? The cucumber mint is particularly refreshing." Patricia, or Wellington as many neighbors called her behind her back, a reference to both her name and her imperious bearing, did not return my smile. Her gaze swept over my setup with the intensity of a health inspector in a questionable kitchen. "This," she said, gesturing to my stand, "is a clear violation of HOA Bylaw 7.4, which expressly prohibits unauthorized commercial activities on residential properties." I maintained my calm demeanor. "Actually, Patricia, I've read the bylaws quite thoroughly. Commercial activities that create excessive traffic, noise, or visible inventory are prohibited. My small refreshment stand does none of those things. Besides, I'm not running a business. I'm just covering my costs during a heat wave as a service to our community." Patricia's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Bennett, I don't think you understand. Any exchange of goods for money constitutes a commercial transaction. The board takes these violations very seriously." "I'm happy to discuss this with the full board," I replied. "In fact, I see Roger coming now. He's on the board, isn't he? He seemed to enjoy his lemonade about an hour ago." Patricia's eyes narrowed as she spotted Roger Lewis, our neighborhood's retired judge and HOA board member, approaching with his golden retriever. Roger waved cheerfully as he drew near. "Afternoon, Robert, Patricia," he greeted us. "Any of that cucumber concoction left, Robert? Delicious stuff." "Plenty," I replied, reaching for a clean glass. "Patricia and I were just discussing whether my lemonade stand violates any HOA regulations. What's your take as a board member?" Roger chuckled as he accepted the glass I offered. "Good Lord, no. We have rules against running businesses, not against being neighborly during a heat wave. Patricia, you can't seriously be concerned about this?" Patricia's lips thinned to almost nothing. "The bylaws are clear, Roger. We can't make exceptions based on personal preferences." We make reasonable interpretations based on the spirit of the rules all the time, Roger countered, taking a long drink of his lemonade. That's why we have a board instead of just a rule book. Robert's stand is delightful, just what we need in this heat. I could practically see Patricia recalculating her approach. Well, there are still proper channels. If Mr. Bennett wants to continue, he should submit a formal request at next month's meeting. By which time the heat wave will be over, I observed mildly. It seems rather excessive for a temporary community service. Roger nodded in agreement. Patricia, surely we have more important matters to focus on, the Morgans' unapproved fence extension, for instance. Recognizing she was outnumbered, Patricia straightened her already impeccable posture. Very well, I'll note this discussion in my records, but Mr. Bennett, this should not become a regular occurrence. Just while the heat advisory is in effect, I assured her. Another week at most, according to the forecast. With a tight nod, Patricia continued on her way, her heels clicking with slightly more force than before. Roger winked at me. She'll find something else to focus on by tomorrow. Your stand is the talk of the neighborhood, in a good way. Don't worry about Patricia. But I did worry, and with good reason, as it turned out. The next day was Saturday, and with the temperature climbing even higher, I set up my stand earlier, at 9 a.m. Weekend foot traffic was heavier, and I found myself continuously refilling the dispensers and washing glasses. By early afternoon, I had served nearly 60 people and collected almost $300, well over my costs, to my surprise. I should donate the extra to the community park fund. That would be a nice gesture, and might even get Patricia off my back. Around 2 p.m. I stepped inside briefly to bring out more lemons and strawberries. When I returned just 5 minutes later, I found Patricia standing behind my bar cart, the cash box open in her hands. Patricia, what are you doing? I asked, setting down my supplies. She didn't even flinch or look guilty, just fixed me with a stern look. As HOA president, I'm conducting an inspection of this commercial enterprise. Since you insist on continuing without proper authorization, the board will need to assess a daily fine based on your revenues. Put the cash box down, I said firmly, no longer maintaining my pleasant facade. You have no authority to touch my property or my money. Patricia snapped the box shut, but kept it in her hands. This money represents rule violations, Mr. Bennett. The HOA has every right to collect fines for violations. That's not how fines work, and you know it, I replied, stepping closer. Fines are formally assessed, documented, and billed, not collected on the spot in cash. What you're doing right now is theft, Patricia. A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather, attracted by our raised voices. Patricia glanced around, seemingly just now realizing she had an audience. I am securing these funds pending official board action, she declared loudly. As president, you still have to follow proper procedures, came Roger's voice as he pushed through the small crowd. Patricia, what on earth are you doing? Roger, I'm glad you're here, she said, her tone shifting to something more formal and official. I am documenting the extent of Mr. Bennett's commercial activities as discussed yesterday. By taking his money? Roger asked incredulously. Put the cash box down immediately. Patricia clutched the box tighter. This represents fines that have not been assessed, voted on, or documented, Roger interrupted. Patricia, as a fellow board member, I'm telling you to put that down before this becomes a much bigger issue than a lemonade stand. For a moment it seemed Patricia might comply. Then, with a swift motion, she tucked the cash box under her arm. I'll bring this to the emergency board meeting I'm calling for this evening. The funds will be properly documented there. Before anyone could stop her, she turned and strode quickly away, cash box firmly in her possession. Did that really happen? Asked Ellen, who had been watching the scene unfold. Did our HOA president just take your money? Yes, I said, pulling out my phone. She absolutely did. And while I don't want to escalate this unnecessarily, what she just did wasn't an HOA action. It was theft. Roger put a hand on my shoulder. Call the police, Robert. I'll give a statement as a witness, and I'm sure others here will too. This has gone well beyond HOA business. I nodded and dialed the non-emergency police number, explaining the situation calmly. To my surprise, the dispatcher said they would send someone right away. Apparently, the brazen theft of a cash box in front of multiple witnesses warranted prompt attention. While waiting for the police, I learned some interesting information from my neighbors. Patricia's zeal for rule enforcement, it seemed, wasn't limited to my lemonade stand. Over the past year, she had been collecting on-the-spot fines from several residents for various alleged violations. Everything from improper garbage can placement to unauthorized plant selections. Most people had paid, assuming it was legitimate HOA procedure and preferring to avoid conflict. She told me it was a new streamlined system to avoid paperwork, said Michael from across the street. Collected $60 because my holiday lights stayed up 2 days past the January deadline. I exchanged looks with Roger, whose judicial background made the implications clear to both of us. This wasn't just about my $300. The police arrived within 20 minutes, Officer Garcia and Officer Patel. They took statements from me and several witnesses, including Roger, who made sure to emphasize his position on the HOA board. So to be clear, Officer Garcia summarized, the HOA president took approximately $300 in cash from your lemonade stand, claiming it was for fines, but there was no official assessment of these fines, no documentation, and no board approval? That's correct, I confirmed. And based on what neighbors are telling me, this may not be the first time. Officer Patel finished making notes in her tablet. We'll need to speak with Ms. Wellington. Do you know where she lives? Roger provided Patricia's address, just 2 blocks away. She mentioned an emergency board meeting this evening, but as a board member, I've received no such notification, which is another procedural violation. The officers thanked us for the information and departed for Patricia's house. Several neighbors stayed behind, helping me clean up my stand while sharing more stories about Patricia's increasingly autocratic rule over our HOA. Last month she told the Harrises they couldn't plant a vegetable garden because food production was agricultural use of residential property, Ellen recounted. Made them rip out tomato plants that had already been growing for weeks. She cited me for an unapproved decorative element because I'd put a pride flag out in June, added Michael. When I checked the bylaws, there was nothing prohibiting flags, but I paid the fine anyway because I didn't want the hassle. The more I heard, the more concerned I became. This wasn't just about overzealous rule enforcement, it was beginning to sound like a pattern of intimidation and possibly fraud. About an hour later, Roger's phone rang. After a brief conversation, he turned to those of us still gathered on my lawn. "That was Derek from the board," he said, his expression serious. "The police are at Patricia's house, and they've asked for an emergency meeting with all board members. Apparently, there's a situation developing." I thanked everyone for their support and began packing up my lemonade stand equipment. Whatever was happening with Patricia would take its course. I had made my report and given my statement. Now it was in the hands of the authorities. The next morning, I was enjoying my coffee on the back patio when my doorbell rang. I opened the front door to find Roger standing there with another man I recognized as Derek Chaudhry, the HOA treasurer. "Good morning," I greeted them, stepping back to invite them in. "Would you like some coffee?" "That would be great, thanks," Roger said as they followed me to the kitchen. "We have some information we thought you should hear directly from us before neighborhood gossip takes over." I raised an eyebrow as I poured coffee for my guests. "About Patricia, I assume?" Derek nodded gravely. "The police asked us to review our HOA financial records yesterday evening. What we found, was deeply disturbing. It appears Patricia has been collecting unauthorized fines for at least 14 months, Roger continued. None of this money ever made it into the HOA accounts. Based on resident reports and her own records, which the police obtained with a warrant, we're looking at potentially $15,000 to $20,000. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. That much? From fines? Derek nodded. She kept meticulous records, ironically. A separate ledger detailing every violation and payment, but none of it ever reached the official books. I'm the treasurer, and I never saw a penny of those funds. The truly incriminating part, Roger added, was that she had multiple cash deposits to her personal account, matching the amounts and dates in her unofficial ledger. When the police confronted her with this evidence, she claimed it was all a temporary administrative arrangement and that she intended to transfer the funds to the HOA eventually. But there was no record of any such plan in board minutes or communications, Derek said, and some of these collections dated back over a year. The emergency board meeting she claimed to be calling about your lemonade stand? Never officially scheduled. We think she was planning to create retroactive documentation once she realized she was being investigated. I sat down at my kitchen table, processing this information. So, what happens now? Roger and Derek exchanged glances. We came to tell you that your cash box and its contents are being held as evidence, Roger explained. The police will need a statement from you regarding the exact amount that was in it when Patricia took it, and there may be additional questions as the investigation continues. Of course, I agreed. Anything they need. Also, Derek added, as treasurer, I want to assure you that once this legal matter is resolved, any funds of yours being held as evidence will be returned in full, and on behalf of the board, I apologize for this extraordinary situation. I nodded my appreciation. Thank you for coming to tell me personally. I assume Patricia is... Before I could finish my question, Roger's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, then looked up with a startled expression. Well, that answers that question. The police just took Patricia into custody. They're charging her with multiple counts of theft and fraud. Derek checked his own phone as it chimed with a notification. The neighborhood watch group chat is blowing up. Apparently they're doing it right now, in front of her house. Curiosity got the better of all three of us. We moved to my front windows, which offered a partial view down the street toward Patricia's house. Even from this distance, we could see the police cruiser parked in her driveway and a small crowd gathering on the sidewalk. I think we should go official statements from the board ready, Derek said, already typing on his phone. This is going to spread like wildfire. Roger nodded in agreement. Robert, it seems your lemonade stand did more than refresh the neighborhood during a heat wave. It may have exposed a significant breach of trust. We decided to walk down the street to get a better understanding of what was happening. As we approached Patricia's house, we could see her being escorted from her front door by officers Garcia and Patel. Even from a distance, her rigid posture and lifted chin were unmistakable. Patricia Wellington was maintaining her dignity, even as her world collapsed around her. The small crowd of neighbors fell silent as Patricia was led to the police cruiser. Her gaze swept over them, pausing briefly when she spotted me standing with Roger and Derek. For a moment, her composure cracked. Her eyes widened in recognition, and a flash of something like realization crossed her face. She never expected her downfall would come from a simple lemonade stand. How ironic. Officer Garcia was reading Miranda rights as Officer Patel opened the rear door of the cruiser. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Patricia suddenly stopped walking, causing the officers to pause. This is ridiculous, she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. I am the president of this HOA. I have been protecting property values and community standards. Everything I did was for the good of Oakwood Estates. No one in the crowd responded. After years of her strict and apparently fraudulent rule, there was little sympathy to be found. Miss Wellington, please get into the vehicle, Officer Patel said firmly. Patricia's gaze found me again in the crowd. This is your fault, she said, her voice cracking slightly. You and your unauthorized lemonade stand. Before I could respond, not that I planned to engage, Officer Garcia gently but firmly guided her into the back seat of the cruiser. As the door closed behind her, Patricia's face was a mask of shock and disbelief, visible through the window. The woman who had ruled our neighborhood with an iron fist and a rule book was now facing consequences far beyond any HOA violation. The cruiser backed slowly out of the driveway as neighbors watched in stunned silence. Through the rear window, Patricia sat perfectly upright, staring straight ahead, her world of control and authority collapsing around her with each foot the police car traveled away from the community she had thought she owned.